Okay, let's make a start. Thank you, by the way, DJ Andrew. Yeah. Mr. AV, let's give him a round of applause. Okay, so Horizon Zero Dawn, we know how it ended up. It's all good. And multiple awards and lots of critical acclaim. But when this project started, for this gentleman on my right, it was really a series of major challenges away from the kind of products that they had been making. That's fair enough?
That's fair enough.
So here to talk about how they overcame those challenges, please will you welcome Bastian Seelbach.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all here. It has been a blast so far. Really good, interesting presentations, I'm excited, very excited to talk to you today about dealing with scope and scale in a brand new open world. And specifically, we're going to look into the cinematic audio production of Horizon Zero Dawn. Short introduction about me. So I'm audio lead at Guerrilla Games. I'm in games, game audio about 12 years now. Worked for 5 different companies and shipped more than 15 games already. That's crazy. And those games in a really wide range between like tiny mobile and browser games up to AAA games. I've been freelancing for a bunch of years, and it's also why I kind of at least tell myself that I have a strong production background. And since April 2016, I'm part of Guerrilla Games in Amsterdam. All right, so before we start going, I just would like to see some hands here. So who of you guys have played Horizon Zero Dawn? Great, that's awesome. And so then the hands for who has not played it yet. Cool. So that's good to know because I realized relatively late when I did this presentation that one of the examples that I'm using is actually a major story spoiler. So for those guys who are actually still intending to do it, I'm gonna give you a warning ahead of time, so you can close your eyes and ears if you don't want to see it. All right. So what's this talk about? So this talk is about a big challenge in scope and scale, and how we found solutions for it. It's also about working on a brand new IP, which is Horizon, with a new team in a new company. To give you a bit of an impression about the timeline of Horizon, let's see if this works. All right. So, as early as 2011, the first small team started working on the game. And while still Guerrilla Games had still Killzone Shadowfall in production. So in 2014, Shadowfall launched, and that was also the moment where the majority of the team actually switched over to the Horizon production. And then there's a long, long time here, and that's where I joined. So April 2016, we launched over here, just a few months into production still, and yeah, so looking back for me on Horizon feels almost like traveling back in time. It's just about 1.5 years ago that we actually shipped the game, but so much happened since then, and we got fantastic feedback from fans all over the world, and we sold a lot of copies of the game. But when I joined Guerrilla Games, that was like very, very far away still. In fact, I don't think that there was anybody in the company that believed in the success like we in the end achieved back in that time. So Guerrilla Games was facing a lot of challenges. We were working on a brand new IP, on an open world game. That's something completely new for the company. With a third-person perspective. Therefore, we needed a lot of new technology, and we had several new departments for that new type of game. So in many ways, Guerrilla Games was actually leaving their comfort zone. And Horizon was sort of like a major pivot point in terms of artistic and technical aspects for the studio. All right, so what did we know by that time? So we knew we're going to do an open world game. We knew Aloy as our lead female character. We knew machines. We're going to have the big machines as our main encounter in the game. We knew about our post-apocalyptic world with lush environments and beautiful nature. We knew that we're going to have different cultures that are living in that world. And we also knew that we will have mainly ranged tactical combat in it. I'm going to give a quick tour through the challenges, a bit more in detail. So we had a new IP. So Aloy was clear, but big parts of the story were still under construction by that time. Few quests were actually playable. When I started, I think there was 1 or maybe 2 quests that you could already play. Then we had to go through a major iteration on the technology. So the engine was in revision for open world purposes, and many tools for the new departments were still under construction or kind of like in the making. So at this new type of game, so Guerrilla Games came from the rather linear shooter series Killzone, which they had actually worked on for more than a decade, and now they were doing like open world. So the core game mechanics had to be identified, and by the time I joined, that was actually the case, but they were not kind of tuned yet. So there was actually a lot of iterations going on. So sometimes every week, sometimes even daily changes on the core mechanics were not something unusual. And if you're interested in the general game design approach for Horizon and the challenges that we were specifically facing in that part, there's a really nice talk of my colleague Eric Boltius, and he held that talk at this year's GDC, and I think it's free. It's not even in the vault, so you can just go there and check it out. So then we had also a bunch of brand new departments. So we had a narrative department, so they had to come up with a story. And obviously, if you are writing the story, there's a lot of dependencies towards your team. We had a brand new quest department for open world quests. So they obviously were involved with the narrative department, but also with tech and core design. And then we had open world content. And it was something completely new for the company in general. You might ask, what was actually the objective when I joined? So for me, that meant I have to make sure that the audio team has everything that it needs in order to work successfully, and then especially make invisible content visible. And that means also identify gaps in our processes and pipelines. And I want to go into one specific area, as said earlier, as an example here. So we're going to look into the cinematics. And it's actually fair to call this part Raiders of the Lost Content. So we had an early estimation of roughly 1 to 1.5 hours of cinematic material. But when I joined, that assessment was pretty dusted already. So it was a given that I have to look into that. And also before I started, it was the anticipation that we would have one audio person taking care of the integration of all cinematics. It's an interesting one. I'm going to come back to that later on. So I had this gut feeling that this was not sufficient. But I had to figure out how accurate the scope estimation was actually, first of all. And then, once I did that, I could also make some estimations. How much do I need to scale the team in order to actually work successfully here? But the problem was, it was not that easy as I thought to verify the scope, and that for several reasons. So the responsibilities for that area wasn't completely sorted. So there were many stakeholders involved, like in different departments, and also the difference between cinematic content and, for example, conversation content was not completely clear yet. And it also didn't make it easier that the Quest department had to define their needs towards cinematics, while the writers were still kind of like in revision with bigger parts of the story. So luckily for me, and also for a bunch of other guys, we hired a cinematic producer around the same time that I was joining, my lovely colleague Jessica Rieger here. And it became pretty fast apparent that we were both looking for the same answers. So we actually approached the problem, look at my lovely doodle, by flanking the issues from both sides, so narrowing it down as much as possible. And in that time, we had a lot of meetings about scope with involved departments, and at the same time, we've been changing our task tracking system to Jira. That was also an interesting one. That turned out to be crucial to visualize the scope, but was actually not without risk that late in the project. So after 2 months of investigation, negotiations, and cutting content, it became clear that we were not just only producing a AAA open world game, but also shooting a 3+ hours movie at the same time. Yeah, you didn't see that coming, Rust, that I know. So, actually, yeah, a big cinematic scope was actually not totally unusual for a typical Guerrilla Games title, but in previous games they often had been pre-rendered. So cinematics were often like Bings, but in Horizon, a third-person open-world game, they were supposed to run in real time in the engine. And also, the scope, 3+ hours, was significantly bigger than in any previous Guerrilla Games title so far. So from an audio perspective, the effort for in-game cinematics can be quite different than if you are actually working on linear, pre-rendered material that you can, just put into your DAW and just sound design and import into the game. So we realized that our teams were not really prepared for the scope, and that we had to inform the studio management about the risk. Yeah, flagging risks, that's a fun one. So I don't know if anybody of you guys have been in that situation that you had to flag a major risk to your company, especially as a new team member that just joined. That's an interesting process to go through. But if you are well prepared, and my experience is always appreciated. So if you're ever going to be in the same situation, I can recommend to you to make sure that you can actually prove your problem by identifying the scope and make it visible in a task tracking tool. Prepare calculations about the bandwidth of the team. Have one or better multiple mitigation plans ready, even if it would require extra budget. So, in other words, offer potential solutions. All right, so with my colleague Jessica's help, I found out how much content we needed to ship. So let's have a look at the audio team's bandwidth suggested. What a lovely team. Okay, so on the left side we have Lucas van Tol, who is our music supervisor, but he is also responsible for, in Horizon, he was responsible for the majority of the environment sounds and in-game Foley sounds. Pinar Temes, she is responsible for all our robots, basically. So she's our robot lady, and yeah, I would say she shipped 85% or 90% of the robots. Anton Voltek, in the middle, is responsible for our core systems and also for all combat-related sounds. Yeah, and me, so taking over all the organizational stuff, responsible for outsourcing stuff, and working in basically all the areas as referenced. Not on the picture, we have Andreas Varga, our tech, our audio programmer, Dave Gomes, our producer, and Francisco Peters, our QA analyst. Okay, so as suggested, let's make a quick assessment of who could help here on the cinematic side of things. Right, Lucas, responsible for music. Well, he will be involved in cinematics, but aside of that, the music aspect, probably not. Pinar, well, she's responsible for the biggest content block in our studio, in our audio team, the robots. So she will also probably commit a bit to cinematics as a side thing, but not be a big contribution here. Then Anton Voltek, again, for all the core systems and weapons and combat stuff, also probably not a candidate, as well as Andreas and Dave and Francisco. Yeah, you can guess it already, who is last in line. I think my face really fits my my emotion when I realized that. So, cool. So we proved successfully that the content was too big for the audio, but also for the cinematic team. The thing that was really good was that within a few days, the company came up with a plan to restructure and relocate the entire production centered around cinematics. So all related disciplines were part of the cinematic production had been identified and assembled. And out of a sudden, there was a large group of 60, 70 people internally, working on cinematic stuff. So let me quickly show you the involved department. It's a bit like a sidetrack, so not really so much relevance, but just to give you a feel. So we have sound effects and music, art, animation, all the different art departments, animation departments, VFX, quest and design, code and tools, narrative, and dialogue and localization. All of those guys had to work on cinematics. Cool. So I don't know if you know that, but Guerrilla Games is actually using its own custom audio engine. It's very alike, and that's why I'm really grateful that you did the talk before me. It's quite similar to what Frostbite does. So it's a node-based audio engine. So for us, fortunate, or for me personally, the fortunate thing was that the core audio pipeline was in a really good shape. So the open world audio systems were prepared. The team did some really good preparation work on that side, and some of the systems needed to be tested still in actual game content, but that was really not a part to worry about. The machines and their complex workflow and setups, they were all already set up, and even though there was still some machines to be filled with content, but the workflow was established, so that was good. And our interactive spawning system, or dynamic spawning system, GUDA, Guerrilla Dynamic Audio, was already prepared and ready to go. So still, the audio team had to scale as well for the cinematic production. But to scale your team, the pipeline has to be scalable as well. I don't know if anybody gets the pun that I've hidden here, but if not, it's also fine. So I knew our workflow was last touched during the Killzone Shadowfall production, which was, as you might remember, linear shooter with pre-rendered cinematics. So that means very different types of requirements, actually. Therefore, I had to go through all the workflows, or through that specific cinematic workflow, note all the steps, measure the time, extrapolate on the amount of content. And it turned out to be, surprisingly, that it was a pretty tedious workflow and not really suitable for our needs, because it was never intended for in-game cinematics. Cool. I tried to visualize this here. Also, somebody told me, if you don't have a graph like this in a presentation, it's a shit presentation. So if you roughly estimate that this is the amount of time that we needed back in that time to integrate our simple cinematic scene into the game, and this is about the time that we had, it was pretty clear that scaling the team at this point in time doesn't make really any sense, because all of those guys would need way too much time to actually do their job. right? So we had to bring this amount, so the iteration time per scene, down to a reasonable level that was closer to what we actually had. Okay, cool. So some things were much better now. We had the close distance of all the related departments, so that improved the communication and the collaboration on the cinematic workflow significantly. And just the matter that we had within the studio, which is quite big, close proximities, you should never underestimate that. But we also had to improve our pipeline to have a scalable workflow. So as mentioned, after the assessment, it was clear that the iteration time for the cinematics were way too high. And in a meeting with Anton, our technical sound designer, and Johanna and Dan from our tools team, we discussed solutions, how to improve the workflow. And in the end, at the very end of this meeting, actually, I pitched an idea that we discussed in the team before. And I thought that was way too ambitious for the time that we actually have, but it felt still kind of worth mentioning, at least. So the dream scenario. For the dream scenario, you need to remember that our cinematics are in-game, as I already said. So we imagined a way to import our Foley and sound effect session straight from Nuendo into our engine. And yeah, after I explained that to Dan and Johanna, they looked at each other, and Dan was trying this actor thing that I saw this morning. Yeah, I think we can actually do this Nuendo import thing that you just pitched to me. It should be no problem. And I was like, what? So my lesson learned in that situation was actually always pitch the most ambitious idea first. We actually could have spared a lot of discussion time if I would have done that. But what I wasn't aware of was actually that the groundwork for that kind of workflow had already been laid for the conversation pipeline, which is related, but we actually did not know that they had certain requirements that were quite similar. All right, let's go through the workflow for a bit. It's going to be a bit more technical now. All right, so here we have our video capture and our Foley and sound effects, cinematic sound effects, and they are basically part of our Nuendo session. Nuendo is our DAW of choice, and it's pretty deeply connected to our workflow. So those Nuendo sessions are actually actively maintained by a special Perforce plugin that we have, so we don't have to do any of the file operations. So we don't need to add anything, or we don't need to delete anything. That's all automatically handled by our plugin. So from Nuendo, we export manually our WAV files, and we export a CSV file. That's a text file, comma-separated text file. And yeah, that's the point where actually our engine, Decima, comes into play, and we have this importer function. And that importer function creates for us the wave resources and the graph sounds with the logic, and places all those in our subsequence. And the subsequence is part of the bigger master sequence for the cinematic. And we have a subsequence because the master sequence is used by many people. So we try to stay away from that by having our own sequence. And that again is all automatically managed by Perforce, so the file operations are not anything that we actually do. Cool. So there are two steps where we actually have to do something manually. We get the Nuendo session, we export the CSV files, and the CSV files contain all the relevant data and all the informations that we need to create the events later on in the game. I explained that in detail, so no worries if you can't follow. And the WAV files, and the other point is our Decima importer, so that's the point where we actually get it into the game. All right, cool. I don't need to go back. Straight jump into our Nuendo sessions. So very important for this process was that we defined the structure of the sessions ahead of time. Because without a proper structure and without planning this very precisely, our workflow would not work in the end. So as you can see here, we have a master track that actually goes all the way along over the course of the entire cinematic. And that contains several information bits for us. First of all, it contains the name of the scene that we are in. So in this case, it's Main Quest 1 Motherless. And it also has the information about the length of the scene. So it is obvious that we are working with timing locked scenes. When the timing changes, we need to change the master track. And then you can see here, we have all those folders. And basically for every actor, we have a folder, right? So we have Aloy here, we have Rost, we have some Nora women, a man and child, not really specified, so you can assume that this is kind of like a random NPC. We have a scientist, I don't know who that guy is. And you can also see that not all of those actors have actually audio files in this scene. Actually, this one has. But the reason for that is that we can, within one Nuendo session, we can have multiple cinematics of the same quest. So Rost, for example, might have audio content further down the line. Okay, so I opened one of those folders, and you can see there's another marker track in there. And you see this one is from Aloy. And you see, okay, we have a bunch of smaller markers here. The reason for that is we don't want to export like one long audio file for that cinematic. So we actually identify in which areas do we have content and try to group that as meaningful as possible. And then export, in this case, how much is it? Seven ranges. And we know the timings of those ranges because we know where it is in relation to our master marker track. And that means that those bits here stay empty. And it's also good in terms of like data. You don't want to have like large data amounts, so this helps as well. You can see here we have another two folders down the line. I'm going to open them for you. So that's actually where the audio files live. Right? So we have footsteps here, and we have other Foley parts. So that's in those folders. And this structure applies for every single actor in this scene. And that's really important. So actually, Ian, are you here? Ah, over there. Because, yeah, I think Ian will remember this workflow quite well. All right, so so from there on, we have this, I showed you the structure of the sessions and how our markers are structured. We have to export the CSV file, and we select the marker tracks that are actually relevant. I did forget to select the master track, export that, do an export of the WAV files. And then we drop right into our importer window, and here we have again the marker tracks. We know which names are we have. The names that are shown up are the names of the markers of the actors. We have the actor window where we can select a correlating actor. We have a window where we can actually select the type of locator that we want to attach the sound to. In this case, it's a bone locator, and we select a spine joint. For those actors actually as a source of the sound. And then down here, we actually have the selection. It's a drop-down selection for the scene that we are actually working in. So this drop-down will show all the relevant scenes of the same quest line. Okay, so we only have to press import. And yeah, so then you drop right into our engine. And all those events here, this is a different scene, so it's a bit more easy to read, are automatically created for us. So all those audio events. And those audio events are not just like simple sound files. Those audio events are graph sounds. So they are the same type of sounds that we use for any other sound in the game, so with all the logic involved. So, and that also explains why the workflow was so tedious, because you have to imagine that each of those tiny bits and pieces here needed to be created by hand before, right? So you have to create all those things as if you would create a sound that goes straight into our game and runs real time. Okay, cool. Yeah, I prepared a quick picture how the logic bit looks like, and there's a reference again. Looks familiar. Yeah, you can see this is each of those blocks looks actually inside looks something like that. Cool. So if the game is running and you imported your Nuendo session into our engine, from here on, you can straight drop into the game, and all the sounds are there. And actually, and that's the cool thing, you can do that even if you re-import stuff. You can, so this generated sequence will not change in that sense. So, for example, like if you change any kind of like fall of curves or whatever for that particular scene, and you just want to exchange the WAV files, you just re-import all the files. You don't need to do the assignment anymore. It's just a one-click thing, and it will automatically update all the relevant parts in the sequence. And yeah, and this is basically how it looks like if you look into the game engine with a bit of like debug information. Triggering, this is like a cinematic later on in the game, and we're getting closer. You can sense it already. So you have some debug information down here where you see the files and you see the ranges of the triggered sound events. And all of this was only possible because Nuendo was so tightly weaved into our engine. So as I said, like all the file operations are actually automated. And also in our general workflow, Nuendo is basically if you want to re-export something, you just do that, and it goes straight into the game. So that's a pretty cool workflow, actually. You can imagine that this new workflow saved a lot of time. In fact, it actually reduced our workflow that we had before by the factor of 8 to 10. So we were pretty close to actually what we wanted to have in the very beginning. And yeah, that was a major improvement. And yeah, obviously I realized I talked through all of this stuff now. It's pretty dry and pretty technical, so at least I brought like one cinematic as a reference, how it sounded like in the game. And this is the moment where I have to tell you guys, so 2 disclaimers. First of all, the transition out is pretty abrupt. The reason for it, that is actually not covering the transition into our real game engine. And the second disclaimer, if you don't want to spoil yourself, then don't listen to it.
Hold for identiscan. Error. Alpha registry corrupted. Correction. Alpha registry restored. Genetic identity confirmed. Entry authorized. Greetings, Dr. Seelbach. You are clear to proceed.
Try to simulate a transition. Doesn't work. Cool. All right, so this worked pretty well, and we were really happy with the results. Yeah, fun fact, this also had side effects, and they were not really expected. So as you might know, All of the guys that have played Horizon know that potentially there are a lot of NPCs in Horizon. And all of those guys actually have a bunch of routines. So they are basically filling the world with life. And yeah, that was interesting because at one point, actually, Anton had this idea, well, those guys are also running on sequences. So it's the same system as our cinematics, just a very different type of purpose. No camera log, obviously, and position in the world. But what if we could actually use this workflow that we just updated for the cinematics and use it for this particular part of the content pipeline as well? Yeah. Quick discussion with Dan, and he was like, yeah, let me think about that. And after a day of work, it was actually set up and done. So we actually improved our pipeline for one specific purpose to fix one big production problem, but we could also apply it to a completely unrelated field and improve our workflow there as well. Cool. So the next things kind of happened in parallel. I just want to point that out. So while the tool teams was working on technical solutions to make sure the pipeline was scalable, I could focus on finding the right candidates for our in-house integration and external help on the content production. And we scaled our team from the internal 4 guys, 4 content sound guys, up to 10 people that were helping us at peak times within our company, and another 10 plus persons, or people that were working for us externally, so sound designer, Foley, artist, for the last couple of months of the production. Yeah, so the changes on the pipeline enabled us to get a bunch of really talented guys in to help us. So with the support of our Sony internal teams in London and San Diego, as well as a team of fantastic freelancers, we managed to ship more than 170 cinematic scenes and more than 3 hours of cinematic material within roughly 3.5, 4 months of production time. So that's quite an achievement. And more important, we actually shipped the game in time. But that is a totally different story that I'm not going to touch in this talk. That is a talk on its own. Yeah, we all know how the story ended. Horizon sold millions of copies and is Sony's most successful new IP on the PlayStation 4. Fans around the globe love it, not just, but also because of its story and characters. And our cinematics had a big stake in making that happen. And as we saw, there have been 2 major pillars for our success in the cinematic production. First was identifying the scope of what we had to ship in the end and make it visible to the company, so the scope part. And second, the decision to actually restructure and scale almost the entire team around cinematics, but also making sure that our pipeline can actually cope with additional headcount, so the scale part of it. None of those solutions would have worked without the other, right? So if you improve your pipeline and don't know what the scale is, what the scope is, it doesn't make any sense, and the other way around. So yeah, for me, working on Horizon was definitely an experience that changed my perspective. What you can actually, move if an entire company is laser focused on solving like one particular problem. And I'm really happy that that I was part of this challenge and could help actually solving it. And also, obviously, I'm very happy to have such a talented team around me. So, yeah. That's good.
Thank you very much, Bastian. We have a few minutes. So,
yeah, I'm surprised.
Any questions?
Hey, thanks for that talk. That's really impressive. I almost couldn't believe it when you said at the beginning, in these 9 months you did all of that. Amazing stuff. For the outsourcing, was this just for the cinematics, or did you outsource other parts of audio too?
Yeah, as I said, we had a bunch of groups within Sony that helped us with different type of content, but mainly cinematics. But we also had freelancers that helped us on the Foley, in-game Foley side, for example. Yeah, so there are areas that we actually outsource, and a lot of the content was actually produced within Guerrilla.
Cool. If I may, one more. You talked about attacking this problem of scope from the two sides. Could you go into a little more detail on how you approached that and how you managed to crack this tough nut?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big challenge there was that so many stakeholders were involved, right? So all the departments that touched, that had some connection points with cinematics, had influence on that, on the scope, the possible potential scope. So from my side, it was really important to look into what our team could actually do. So the exercise that we did, and to check the pipeline. So that was the audio side of things, right? And then from the cinematic side of view, it was really kind of getting everybody on the table and really discussing content, identifying content, also identifying scenes that could be cut, or that might be different types of content, like conversations, for example. So it was really like almost like coming from those two sides was totally necessary to actually identify the entire thing in the end.
Cool. Thank you, and once again, congratulations.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Great talk, Bastian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You talked about dynamic spawning system. Is
Yes.
that so? Your dependencies are very much on whether the cinematic side gets that side of the pipeline gets complete. As you don't want to be blocked by those guys, right?
Yeah.
So you depend on them just as much as any of your audio guys.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to come in. Did they do a similar scale up? Those guys?
Who are you referencing
So
to?
I mean the visual side of the kind of scene setting,
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Yeah, as you can imagine, when we scaled the production on the cinematic side, there was a lot of stuff happening at the same time, right? So
Yeah.
we were obviously dependent on at least camera-locked scenes. So that's really important. If you want to give a scene to an outsourcing partner, for example, that material needs to be at least timing locked, right? So no bigger changes in an ideal world.
Yeah. It's a hopeless dream for us, I tell you.
So yeah, we approached it in a way that we worked with. We did in the main, or in most of the cases, we actually did two passes, right? The first thing where we could work on the Foley stuff. Yeah. For that we had to know what kind of surface we were walking on, and what kind of costumes the actors would have, and then the second pass we would do later when we had VFX and all those things coming in as well. So yeah, there wasn't a dependency, but that was rather like a workflow dependency, and we had to structure our workflow around that problem, basically.
Yeah. What, if I may ask one more question? What about your templates, your Nuendo templates? Were they all standard, one standard template that was huge, or did you have lots of different templates?
So the template was always the same structure, as you saw. We basically designed the template up front, mm-hmm. and then we used that template for every cinematic in our production. Okay. So it's not like one huge. So for every main quest we had a different session that makes it large on the linear side, but not really like super complex on the horizontal. No, is that vertical or horizontal? Oh, sorry, I'm always
vertical.
Yeah, vertical side. Yeah. Sorry. So that keeps kind of just the amount of actors at bay, right? If you would have like more than one main quest in one session, there would be way too much actors to actually keep the structure. So dividing it by the main quests, for example, or the side quests, made a lot of sense in order to keep the template small.
And did you have a line for visual effects?
Yeah, there's a separate folder in the case where we have cinematic sound effects for visuals, explosions, or whatever else.
Okay.
There's a separate folder, almost like an actor folder for that purpose.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been hogging this.
Oh, good.
Thank you, Bastian. I'm sorry, but I think we're out of time. But Bastian's going to take part in the open mic session, so we can maybe ask him some more stuff then. But for now, have a good break. See you just before 5, and thank you, Bastian. Nice one.